Professor Gerges is Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics, where he has been since 2010. Before that, he taught at various universities in the States and had a chair at Sarah Lawrence College in New York. He is interested particularly, I would say, in the international relations of the Middle East. He's also written a book very recently called The New Middle East, Social Protest and Revolution in the Arab World. Another recent book is Obama and the Middle East, The End of America's Moment. So, The Far Enemy, Why Jihad Went Global, and several other books. His special interests include Islam and the political process, and mainstream Islamist movements and jihadist groups. I mean, his talk earlier in the week was about sort of Islamic movements in Egypt and their resilience and persistence. He's interested in Arab politics and Muslim politics in the 20th century, the international relations of the Middle East, the political economy of the Middle East, and state and society in the region. I also noticed the modern history of the Middle East, which seems something I'm vaguely familiar with. And today he's going to talk about Syria and the Arab uprisings, similarities and differences.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for your kind introduction. I'm delighted to see all of you here, and thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to, especially late afternoon. I hope that by the end of my talk today, I will succeed if I really give you an idea why Syria differs from other Arab countries, and how do we make sense of what has happened in Syria in the last 3 years, and why Syria has not gone the way that Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen have gone since the Arab Uprisings. And to do so, I want to basically raise two questions. One conceptual question and one policy-oriented questions. And I hope that the two questions will contextualize my talk today. The first conceptual question I want to raise is that while the Arab uprisings, or whether the Arab uprisings can be assimilated, I mean, it's a question whether the Arab uprising can be assimilated to a long-standing tradition of popular action driven by local and Islamic notions of moral economy. That is, you need to remember Charles Tripp has just come out with, Charles Tripp is a leading scholar on the Middle East politics in SOAS, has written a book on resistance, historically speaking, in the Arab and Muslim world in the last 50 or 60 years. But what we need to remember is that there is a long tradition of popular action driven by notions of the moral economy in Islamic societies, and whether what has happened in the Arab world in the last few years can be assimilated into this long tradition of popular action driven by notions of the moral economy in Muslim societies. Another variant of the question, and whether the cumulative divergence, between the cohesive, the so-called cohesive states of the imperial core. So we have what some scholars, theorists call cohesive states of the imperial core. We talk mainly about Egypt and to a lesser extent Tunisia and other societies. And the tribes with flags, or the periphery state, the Ibn Khaldunian periphery states. The difference between the cohesive states of the imperial core and the periphery states, or what some political scientists call tribes with flags, can explain the different outcomes of revolt in the Arab world. So we have, on the one hand, Egypt And Tunisia, on the other hand, we have Syria, we have Yemen, and we have these are periphery states. Some people call them tribes with flags because of state formation. The state formations since the early part of the 20th century differs fundamentally from the cohesive states of the imperial core and the periphery state. And there's no time to even mention the modern history of the Middle East. I think this is part of how the system, the formation of the modern Middle Eastern state system. So this is a point I really would like you to keep in mind conceptually, whether this particular question helps us to understand. I mean, it's just a question. What has happened in Syria in the last 3 years? The second policy question, very trivial question, is that the big question is that why has the policy community, the policy establishment in the West, in the Western countries, got Syria in the last 3 years? And what I mean by that is that think, and I'm not saying anything original here, what the dominant narrative about Syria from the beginning, the first 1 or 2 years. It was Assad's days were numbered. His ship was sinking. It was a matter of weeks, a matter of months, and Assad would be gone, and Syria would basically reach a harbor of popular uprising that Tunisia and Egypt did reach. Whether you're talking about the American President Barack Obama, or the French former President Sarkozy, or Cameron, this became really conventional wisdom. Assad would not last. It was a matter of weeks, months at a time. The reason why this is very important, the policy question, for us to understand, because I think, again, if you listen and if you observe carefully the actions and the strategies of the Syrian opposition, basically they really believe in this particular paradigm, that Assad would collapse, that Syria would go the Tunisian and Egyptian way, and the strategy of the opposition, and I feel for the opposition, is that basically believe that Syria would be offered on a silver platter in the same way that Libya was offered. This was the strategy, and we talked to quite a few of them, Burhan, you and others, our friends within the opposition, who really believed it was a matter of trying to convince the West to intervene along the same way to Libya. And no organization, no planning, no strategic architecture. They believe in militarizing the opposition. They really went for the kill. They believed it was the moment. And that's a few days ago, Syria passed the 3-year mark, as you know, the anniversary. And I'm afraid to say that this is a conflict that might last for 10 years, if not more, based on what has transpired in Syria in the last. And I'm going to just put some ideas on the table and see whether what I say makes sense or whether I'm exaggerating the complexity and the enormity of the problems that Syria has. But before I do that, since my talk is about the first question, the consumption question, is that, and I know you've read a great deal about the Arab uprisings. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on talking about the Arab uprisings because my talk today is, I just want to say a few things about the Arab uprisings, so just to compare and contrast what has happened in the neighborhood so we can understand why Syria. I think I would argue there is a common thread that runs through the Arab revolts, a common one. And I think if I can simplify by saying economic vulnerabilities, I mean severe economic vulnerabilities and the quest for effective citizenship. These two really ideas or frameworks that help us to understand why the Arabs finally revolted against their tormentors, their authoritarian tormentors in 2010 till the present. And I think if we, again, repeat for the sake of it, the rallying cries of the Arab uprisings, I'm probably aboard with it, al-Hurriya, al-Adala, al-Karama, freedom, justice, social justice, and dignity. These summarize the aspirations of millions of Arabs. That is, a life in dignity, sense of bread and butter, social justice, effective citizenship. I'm not talking about democracy, please remember. Effective citizenship does not mean that somehow the millions of Arabs would have revolted. They wanted to create a liberal kind of democracy, but they wanted to live as, you know, citizens and dignified citizens in their societies. Again, another point I want to mention is that what's really unique about the Arab Uprisings is that the countryside, the agrarian poor and the urban poor, we need to really keep stressing this particular point, played a key role in this particular. I mean, they really changed the configuration of the uprisings. It was not just, this is the cities, the main cities. Most of the revolts basically took place outside the cities initially and spread to the cities. So in this particular sense, they reach a critical mass because of the number and the sociological participation. Again, I mentioned in passing, this in a way, it was really the revolt, the uprising of the poor. The first time that the poor joined the urban, the elite, opinion makers elite, and made a difference in what happened in the Arab world. Again, before I think it would be very misleading for some of the students to isolate one particular variable, because we're all social scientists looking for one independent single variable. But there is a reality, no one can really isolate one variable and say this is it. You know, Fred Halliday used to say, single variables don't exist. They simplify complex realities. Get it out of your head as a student in the 1980s. He said that in social sciences, despite, of course, we're fascinated by the single variable, but I think the complexity, if I can summarize really the drivers behind the Arab uprisings, I would say it's a cumulative structural crisis, a cumulative structural crisis of state failure, of developmental failure. State failure, of developmental failure, broadly defined. A severe crisis of authority. The crisis of authority is, as you know, we all know Gramsci. You have to have hegemony and domination. You can't have just domination. The Arab world, most of the Middle East, have been running on empty since the end of the 1980s on domination. They lost that hegemony. The system was not legitimate. And thus, really, domination basically lost the case, because when people reached a particular point of desperate blood. And I think, of course, it started in Tunisia, spread to Egypt and Libya, Yemen, Oman, Bahrain, Syria, and Jordan, and some tiny protests in other Arab countries. Again, throughout the same rallying cries, think about really similar, almost similar, three terms: al-hurriya, al-adala, and al-karama. Similar mobilizational tactics, similar collective action, I mean, literally, and this tells you in a way, for some of us who really grew up on this part of the world, the poor of the Middle East, the Arab world, I think it tells you a great deal about the sociological links that we should really never, despite the fact that the state system, the separate state, has become deeply rooted, that there are very important organic links that basically have resonance. And I would like to challenge this particular sense. I'm not talking about Arab unity, Arab unity, or anything. I'm talking about very important cultural and social and ethnic, and that really resonate in the region. Whether you're talking about a small, tiny village in Sudan, or Libya, or Lebanon, and that's why some of the villages in Tunisia were, joining and saying, "Thank you, Al Jazeera. Thank you, Al Jazeera. You connected us." After all, Al Jazeera was able to connect the hamlets and the villages and the cities, and really bring about this, critical mass protests. Yet, we know now they were significant divergent outcomes as a result of these similar mobilizations and tactics. How do we explain this particular divergence? We need to understand really why in Tunisia and Egypt we had a different outcome, and why in other countries, and this come back to the state formation. The importance of the state formation is very, very important for some of us. I know we don't have a fixed state formation in the same way that Charles Tilly talks about European state formation. Our system still, it's in infancy. It's a baby crawling. Remember 1920s, as opposed to the Westphalian system of 1648, but I think we can still talk about state formation. Look what happened in Egypt and Tunisia. you had homogeneous societies on the whole. Egypt and Tunisia, homogeneous societies. Swift collective action, quick, and a really critical mass, I mean, over just a few days. And I think this particular swift collective action brought about major splits within the military security apparatus and the elite, the governing elite in the societies. Again, I'm simplifying a great deal here, but I would argue that the militaries, the security apparatus, the powers that be in the societies made a strategic decision, particularly I'm talking about the military institutions, to sacrifice the incumbent presidents, whether it was Ben Ali or Mubarak, in order to secure their own privileges institutionally. And I think we can make the case that the military security apparatus in the societies were relatively professional institutions. Relatively, you had ethos of the military, the Egyptian military in particular, even though the Tunisian military is a very tiny institution. And I think so far, I would argue too, just for us to think about, is that the role of the external was very important here. I don't think we have information, credible information about the extent of the external variable. I'm talking here about the role of the US defense establishment in really nudging these institutions to basically push Ben Ali and Mubarak out. But we know, with the tentative evidence we have, that there was major and continuous interaction between the US military defense establishment and the Tunisian and the Egyptian over the period of the protests. And I think, again, I would argue that the role of the external was very important in convincing the military's institutions to somehow, not to fire on the protesters, not to commit carry out a bloodbath, and to save the system, keep the system intact, as opposed to the protest turning into a major revolution. You know the difference between a revolutionary moment and revolution itself. When I say save the institutions, let's put some meat on the skeleton. Again, in Egypt, we think we know that the military institution in Egypt, the military institution controls between 10 and 60% of the economy, give and take. No one knows the numbers, that's how bad it is, really. I've seen numbers by people in the World Bank and IMF, and they don't say it, they say 40%. Now people, of course, in the Arab world, the media and opinion, we have a tendency to exaggerate a great deal when it comes to numbers. We really do. It's a terrible habit sometimes, 50%, 80%. But I think it's fair to say it's in the vicinity of 15, 40%. So there are major institutional privileges involved for the military to intervene and save its and again, it's this helps to explain why Tunisia and Egypt went much quicker and then Syria and Yemen and Libya and others. See, let's start, and here I want to focus with 5 or 6 pointers on the table in terms of priority. See whether what we can make sense, and probably you've heard, you know these particular points, but I still want to make the case of why Syria has differed and why Syria will be with us for quite many years, unfortunately. I think the first point I want to argue is that in Syria, you don't have a relatively professional army, a measure of autonomy and independence. You have an ideological army. An ideological army that basically deeply committed to the protection and preservation of the regime itself. Hafiz al-Assad, I just had a student who did a PhD on politics, internal politics in Syria. Hafiz al-Assad used to boast in his internal to some of his colleagues that he knew the personal details of the 3,000 officers in his army, one by one, their villages, their backgrounds, their families, with particular 3,000. He committed the personal details, 3,000 officers to memory. This is what does this piece of information tell us? It tells us that from day one, given the history, as you know, the turbulent history of Syria, from the late 1940s, that this is an army that was constructed by Hafiz al-Assad for the worst-case scenario, to protect the regime itself. And thus, every officer from junior, talking about lieutenant, Hafiz al-Assad and the inner circle made sure that every officer basically wanted to make sure that no major coup, no major subversive effort would be taken against it. Again, given the history of Syria itself. And that's why, in many ways, from 1970, you're saying the durability of our politics hardly any good at that, because these people who came from this turbulent moment made sure that their security apparatus was indeed very low. I mean, think about it. How many defections have we seen in the same army in the last 3 years? This is an army, again, please don't mind, be skeptical about numbers. We think we know it's about 300,000, give and take. Fewer than a few thousand soldiers, and probably less than 2 dozen officers have defected in the last 3 years. But think of the narrative that, I mean, I thought at some particular point that the entire army was collapsed, truly, as a result. No, seriously. You had Munaf Plus, you had this kind, few once a soldier, an air force went to Syria. The army, the Syrian army, remains intact. Not only, let me provoke you a bit and say, the Syrian army has become a more potent killing machine in the last 3 years. Not less, more potent killing machine. The Syrian army was designed as an obsolete, conventional army to fight state-to-state war with Israel. And that's why the army did not do very well in the last 1.5 years. The army has been restructured and reorganized by Iranian officers over the last, and Russian officers in the last 2 years in particular. It has become now more and more an effective killing urban fighting machine as a result of this organization. It's not less. It's overextended, it's overwhelmed, it's weighed down, and that's why it cannot really, wage battles in many theaters. It wages, because Syria is a huge country, there is war in almost every single province inside Syria. Whether you're talking about the heartland of Assad himself, Al-Latakia, you're talking about Aleppo, you're talking about Idlib, you're talking about Deir Zur, you're talking about Homs, Damascus, the watershed. The army is spread everywhere, but the army remains centralized command and control and intact. And committed to the defense of this bloody, oppressive regime. We've heard another thing about this is an Alawite force designed and basically to protect this Alawite regime. That's the dominant narrative. Wrong. 60% of the conventional Syrian army is still Sunnis. Now, of course, the Republican Guards and the Special Forces are Alawites. These are the spearhead, the vanguard of the regime itself. But the rank and file of the regular army, and these are not my words, some of us who cross to Syria, journalists who go, and the composition of the army, remains, this is 60%, at least 60% of the rank of the Syrian army, the 300 or so soldiers, are Sunnis, not Alawites. Why? Because the regime itself has been, of course, advancing a particular thesis. This is a foreign conspiracy hatched by foreign powers and by the Gulf State terrorist conspiracy. This is a war by Syria against, this foreign conspiracy, the whole idea, this ideological narrative that Assad boasts about from day one. This is part of the Gulf States trying to destroy this old, modern, secular, social fabric of Syria. The resurgence of Syrian nationalism, some of you probably don't make sense of the whole notion of al-Mashriq versus al-Desert, al-Sahra, and you see the speeches that, we are the Mashriq. The Mashriq is the Arab East. This is the heart of Arab civilization. And here, the desert people, the Arabia, the medievalists are trying to destroy, and the whole idea, celebration of Syrian nationalism, not as pan-Arab celebration, the whole idea of this helps explain to a large extent why, Sunni soldiers still fighting with the army, not probably as committed as their Alawite counterparts, but remain deeply. It's an intact army. And I want you to know, despite everything that the Americans and the French security services, they have tried to do, and they have tried to do a great deal, and you know that, in order to, they have acknowledged that they have failed to wean off critical elements of the Syrian army, as they did in Iraq and other places, convince them, because, again, it's a very complex, it's an ideological army, and I'm going to say a few words, not just it's an army, it's a very misleading thing to focus on the army itself. This leads me to my second point, divergence between Syria and other states. The reason why the army has held, unfortunately, for Syria and the Syrian people, is that there is hadina sha'biyya, social base support. And many of us, again, have shied away from really talking about the social base of this regime for a variety of reasons. Because many of us really, we have hoped, we hoped that somehow the regime itself does not have the hadina sha'biyya, social base of support. That basically this stock would not be really supported by, more of, again, I want to provoke you. We don't know the numbers, don't buy my numbers. The social base of the Assad regime is at least 30%. At least 30%. It's not just the base. In fact, some of us who talk to Syrian people when we travel and we cross, the Christians are more bloody fanatical pro-Assad than the Alawites, the Druze, Ismaili. A critical Sunni community, urban, bourgeoisie, merchants, Nouveau-Riche, still basically don't see an alternative to Assad. In fact, the Sunni merchant class powers the Assad economic machine now in Damascus. The Damascus merchant class. Go to Damascus and see what the businessmen who are basically it's not just the Druze and the Christians and the Alawites, and there's a sizable, I don't know the size of this Sunni community, but the Sunni community is terrified of the alternative. They're terrified of what happened in Aleppo, the destruction of the industrial and base of Aleppo, and somehow that they have benefited people from the liberalization policies of Assad 7 years before the uprising. The major beneficiaries, not just the Alawite. The Alawites remain, most of the Alawite community is either villages, poor, or even they join the professional security. But in fact, the major beneficiary is this particular segment of the Sunni community and the Christian community and other communities inside Syria. We don't have social studies about it. And that's the only way when I go to Damascus and they tell you, look, just go talk to them. It's the merchant class, the urban, the Sunni community. And I think the Assad regime advances this particular that what's the alternative? Think of the notion itself. Assad has tried to wrap himself, portray himself as the embodiment of Syrian nationalism, sovereignty. It is, and many Syrians, and in particular in the last 1 year and a half, are really terrified. Sunnis, that if Assad collapses, there would be a security vacuum that would be filled by radical Salafi jihadi element. Ironically, if you look at the reports now coming out by the Western security services, the CIA, and the US military, and the British security, they have reached the same point. In fact, the Americans, we know now, this is now part of open information. The opinion of the American military security is that we don't want Assad to fall at this particular moment because the state will collapse. And I'm going to say a few words about why this is so, as a result of what has happened in the opposition itself. And more and more of the silent majority of Syrians feel that, I hope you don't misunderstand me, they don't like Assad. It's not about Assad. They realize Assad is responsible for, that they're terrified that somehow if Assad collapses, the state will collapse. And they realize what has happened in Iraq, what will happen, that somehow their privileges, their societies, their communities, and what have you. So it's, I think the point I want to highlight, whether you're talking about al-Hadina al-Sha'biyya, the social base, or the military, this is not just the reason why the Assad regime has survived, not just because of the Alawite, the tiny Alawite community that between 9 and 12% give and take. This would not be so. It's impossible. It doesn't make sense. Because even domination, you need to have a bigger, a much more complex situation. And that's why, as a result of what has happened, developments, in particular, the social base of Assad. I mean, I think Assad, again, I'm not saying anything original here, he feels more secure than ever in the last 3 years. This is, I mean, if you look, they really believe they're winning the war, unfortunately. And already preparations are being made for him to make another bid for presidential bid. And this is it is, if you go to Damascus, you go to Homs and other places, you think it somehow will win it. It's just, it's a matter of time. That's the narrative that being at least sold in this country. This brings me to my third point about the divergence between Syria and other Arab countries. And if there is really one point I want to make today, is that the internal Syrian variable, in the Syrian conflict is the least important. If we're trying to really try to understand why Syria is divergent, I would argue that the internal variable in the Syrian conflict is the least important. In fact, again, you know this, is that Syria now has become really more of a theater, a battlefield, a war by proxy. And this particular it's no longer just Assad versus the opposition. There is a fierce geostrategic struggle taking place in the Middle East. A new Cold War, similar to the one some of us who study the Middle East, we used to call it what Malcolm Kerr called the Arab Cold War. Now it's a bigger and a greater fierce Cold War than the 1950s and 1960s. And it's a particular fierce war between Saudi Arabia on the one hand and Iran on the other hand. So these are the big dogs in the region. It's a struggle for hegemony in the Gulf. It's a struggle for hegemony in the Mashraq. It's a titanic struggle between the two powers. What does Iran, again, Syria is very, very important for Iran. It's a cliche. It's very important because Syria gives Iran an outlet to the heart of the Arab world. It's an outlet to the Arab-Israeli conflict, to which Iran has made major investment in the last 2 decades or so. It is the strategic depth of Hezbollah, one of the most important allies of Iran in the heart of the Arab world. And if Assad falls, that's the Iranian reading. Basically, Hezbollah would become the Hamas level, would lose its strategic depth. This would be disastrous to Iran. Think about it. Here you have Iran, a country that has been under one of the most stringent economic sanction regimes in history, bleeding the Iranian economy, yet Iran has invested billions of dollars, precious resources in trying to preserve Syria. This tells you a great deal about how important Syria is to the Iranian leadership and why Syria. And this is the portfolio of the leadership of Iran. This is not the foreign ministry. This is not even the President Ahmadinejad or Rouhani. In fact, when Kerry, some of the leaked report, asked Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, to discuss Syria, Zarif said, this is beyond my pay grade, the Syrian portfolio. This is the portfolio, this is how important it is. It's not just Iran provided the money and logistics. Iran has helped to restructure the Syrian army, to turn this army from a slow elephant into a relatively functioning urban. Not only that, when the situation deteriorated more than a year ago, in particular, the Syrian army was wobbling, and this is a huge rusty machine. Basically, they send the special guards of the Iranian, and that's Hezbollah. Again, I don't say anything new if I say that Hezbollah, according to the opposition and the Americans and the French, that has made a strategic difference in key areas on the battlefield inside Syria. In particular, in the areas in Damascus, in particular on the Lebanese-Syrian border, in particular in Homs. Critical difference on the battlefield changed the landscape of the war itself in these areas. The last battlefield was in Al-Talamun, on first Qusayr and then Yabrul. These very, very important areas. And Hezbollah, even though it's a tiny militia in Lebanon, but it's a very tried militia. It's a very because of its trials against the Israeli army. So in this particular sense, I think we need to understand the divergence and why Assad has survived so, because he has received critical, significant material, military, logistical, and basically fighters on the ground. Saudi Arabia, of course, is waging this particular struggle against Iran because Saudi Arabia refers to the Iranians as mercenaries. They can't accept the fact that Iran is a regional superpower. To them, Iran is infiltrating the heart of the Arab Sunni world. And they cannot basically come to terms with the fact what the Americans did in Iraq. They offered Iraq on a silver platter to the Americans. Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Bahrain, Yemen. Saudi Arabia believed that somehow Iran is really threatening its very, not only security interest, but the whole idea of the Sunni Arab Islam. And unfortunately, Saudi Arabia has used all elements of its power against, in this particular geostrategic struggle, including the sectarian camp. And what I mean by that is that on top of this conflict, ideological conflict inside Syria, you have now a thick layer of sectarianism that is imposed. And this sectarian divide is doing a great deal of harm. It's spreading really like wildfire. It's poisoning the veins of our politics. It is top down because it's ideologically, and it's also bottom up. It's resonating. Whether you're talking about Iraq itself, whether you're talking about Lebanon, whether you're talking about, this is, of course, remember, it's an instrument, a tool of war, but it resonates with these communities that feel their identities are under threat. And I think, remember, the reason why Saudi Arabia feels very besieged because they believe that Iraq was lost. Iraq used to be a counterweight to Iran historically, and by toppling Saddam Hussein, the Americans weakened the immunity system of the Sunni Arab world against Shia, if you would, in terms of Sunni Shia. But Iran is not just a geostrategic power. Iran is a Shia state that's trying to. And in this particular sense, the toppling of Assad from Saudi Arabia would represent a hard blow to Iran, because it not only would basically weaken Iran's ability to exercise power, project power, it would weaken Hezbollah in Lebanon too. It would basically, have major implications. So this particular, what I want to say is that this particular geostrategic struggle has not, you have the sectarian angle, and you have also a Salafi jihadi element to it too. So and now if you see this security architecture in the region, I don't believe that Saudi Arabia is funding Salafi jihadis. I really don't, despite all the conspiracy theories. I think Saudi Arabia is trying to fund and finance groups that basically are fighting the Assad regime. Unfortunately, though, Syria has become a rallying cry for some activists and agents who believe that Ahl Sunnah, the Sunni community, is under threat. And this ideology now, Salafi jihadism, we said a few words about it today, to me, it's really one of the most insidious currents now. Because I think we estimate we have tens of thousands and again, these are not my numbers. They rely on multiple, both independent and American and Western sources. And the numbers are staggering in terms of, and you have them, I mean, they're migrating between Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. I think what you're going to do with this particular, I mean, regardless of what happens in Syria, how are you going to contain this particular, what would be the social implications for societies, for social fabric? The fourth point I want to is that the reason why also the divergence, again, not only the regional element, the global element. I think, again, I'm not saying anything original here. You cannot really understand why Assad has survived for as long as he has survived without understanding the Russian position and the significant support that Assad has received, both political, diplomatic, and material. If you go to Tartus and other areas, you'll see Russian ships, literally, I mean, it's continuous flow of material and resources to Assad by Russia. I mean, they use 3 vetoes, Russia, to support Assad. Again, I don't need to talk a great deal about the Russian position because you know as much as I do how Russia views Syria. And Syria is not important, by the way, for Russia as a state. It's a tiny state, it's a poor state, it's all I expect to see. Syria is a case study whereby the Russian leadership is asserting its role. No more Libyas, no more Iraq. We will not allow you to use the Security Council to change regimes. The so-called sovereignty state is more important than the idea of people's aspiration. This is the idea, Russia, the idea. Yet in Crimea, Russia seems to subscribe that that's great powers can easily have it both ways. And I think in this particular sense, Russia's policy, both politically in terms of diplomatic and material, has played a key role in strengthening the Assad position and basically in emboldening Assad to really, and I would argue is that the conflict now over Ukraine would probably have major consequences for Syria as well. I don't think Russia is going to be more accommodating as a result of what has happened, particularly if the crisis escalates, particularly if the sanctions of the United States and Europe decides to. This is Russia's policy compared with American policy on Syria. I'm not going to say much about American policy because tomorrow I'm going to talk about American foreign policy and the Middle East. But I think while the American rhetoric on Syria has been consistent, Assad must go. I think the United States has been very reluctant to basically directly intervene, let alone to really arm the opposition with any kind of quantitative weapons, even though we are seeing the beginning of a kind of a tactical shift on the part of the United States now. The United States now is beginning to take a much more active stand towards the opposition, particularly the so-called the moderate opposition itself. The final point about divergence is I want to talk about. I talked about the solidity and the homogeneous nature of the collective action in Tunisia and Egypt. Think of the fragmentation of the opposition, and I kept it to the end. I don't think it's a major point. I really don't. Because some people have tried to criticize the opposition, blame it on the opposition. You cannot blame the opposition because there are bigger and greater and more important factors that help us understand why Assad really has weathered so far the storm. But the fact is, you have both the political and the armed opposition is deeply fragmented. I mean, Al-Itilaf al-Watani, the Syrian National Coalition, has failed dismally. It has failed dismally not only to unify its ranks, driven with differences, but also to build a critical base of support inside Syria itself. This is, I mean, people inside Syria don't take the Syrian, I think based on, we don't have field research, but I think based on what we know, we don't think that the Syrian National Coalition really resonates with a large group of Syrians so far. The armed opposition, keep talking about the battles between the Assad regime and the opposition. There are some greater battles taking place between the opposition, between the various factions of the opposition. The war or the battles between the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham, ISIS, and the various groups have basically caused the death of almost 4,000 skilled fighters in 6 months. These are some of the most effective fighters inside Syria. Al-Nusra Front, the official arm of Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham, which is the unofficial. It's the Al-Qaeda-linked fighters, extremist groups. Multiple wars, I mean, we estimate based on various the intelligence sources, because that there are more than 1,200 armed factions inside Syria. No command and control, no unified structure, no strategic collaboration. There are tactical collaboration in certain battlefields, but no strategic coordination. While the Syrian army and its allies, Hezbollah and various militias from Iraq, and there's a centralized command, even though it's slow and it's not as, up to speed. But it's the armed opposition of the 1,200 armed opposition. Again, they receive wisdom based on intelligence sources and the battlefield itself. Show that the most potent fighters are Nusra Front and the so-called ISIS, and the Al-Jabhat Islamiyya, the Islamic Front. Islamic Front numbers about between 30 and 40,000 fighters. It's a kind of a Salafi, ultra-conservative. They're not Salafi jihadi, the Islamic Front. The Salafi jihadis are Al-Nusra and ISIS. The Islamic Front is Salafi, ultra-conservative. It does not subscribe to Al-Qaeda. But some of you might say, what has happened to the Free Syrian Army? The moderate arm of the Free Syrian Army, which is the least important and the least potent and least effective of the various. If you look at the map, and this is the bigger point I had to take, is that unfortunately for Syria and for many of us, is that the early aspirations of the Syrian opposition, the pluralistic, the open society. I mean, the Islamic Front, what do they want? They don't believe in a pluralistic, let alone a democratic state. They want to establish a kind of a Taliban-like state, literally speaking. In fact, ISIS is worse than the Taliban in some of its action in an area and in some of the practices. Al-Nusra, the official arm of Al-Qaeda, is less, but it is as reactionary and as oppressive and as deadly, truly. And this gives you an idea why the Syrian narrative, why Assad narrative has some resonance among some Syrians now. This is a godsend to Assad. If I were Assad, I would celebrate this particular development. I don't think the conspiracy is, ISIS is a creation of Assad. Nonsense. It's just that in a way that this plays into his rhetoric. That, I'm fighting terrorism, trying to, what does this catch mean for Syria? In terms of, we know now why Syria, I hope, has wide divergence. I hope we don't fall into a reverse tendency. Assad's days were numbered, now we can see Assad is winning, Assad is done. Assad is not winning, Assad has survived. Assad cannot win. Assad cannot even pacify and secure the areas. It's awful. He cannot pacify, I mean, huge parts of Syria, gone. How do you retake Arab and Idlib and Deir ez-Zor and Aleppo area? These huge chunks of territories. Not to mention, he lost, anything that has to do with Russian legitimation, the person that is responsible for the killing of tens of thousands of Syrians. What we're left with, Syria, is the point what I'm trying to say is that this is all out conflict. We don't know exactly whether it will last for 5 or 10 years, but I think everything that there does not seem to be a kind of a light at the end of the tunnel. In terms of, given the complexity of this particular and the intersection between internal mutations, the mutations internally, and the regional and the global. You have to change many variables, factors for particular. To give you an idea how similar I see it myself as a person who was born as a teen when the war started. I was 14 years old in Lebanon. Some of you do not know Lebanon. It started as a revolutionary moment, by the way. It was a progressive, broad-based coalition against a reactionary, dominant and minority league. The first year, that's really it was. And yet, in a year, it mutated to what? All out, so 15 years. That's how it all started. It started in Syria as a political uprising and aspiration. And it seems to me that this is really, I don't think it's sectarian conflict, it's all-out conflict with, different features, partly ideological, partly sectarian, communal, ethnic, has multiple, and that's why it's very, very complex. The question is, regardless who wins this conflict, I don't think anyone can win. I don't think the opposition can defeat the Syrian army, Syrian coalition, without foreign intervention. You have to have direct foreign intervention to build the balance of power structurally and substantively. That is, this war can go on because the opposition, as we know, the structure of the opposition can never win this war against, because not only Assad does not have a militia, he has a coalition. He has been able to create a coalition supported by regional power and international power. The question is, for many of us, how are you going to put Syria back? How can Syria be rescued as a civil society? How do you, rebuild the social fabric of Syria? In Lebanon, it has not been rebuilt, by the way. Still, you have communities or tribes with flags, and the country is still on the brink. Not only that, political economy of Syria. How are you going to rebuild this country economically? This is one of the poorest countries. It's a where the resources. How are you going to manage to this? Difficult, complex task. Given, now of course money is coming to Syria to finance the war, but will the same donors really pour tens of billions of dollars to rebuild this country, the damage physically? Forget about I myself don't buy the notion, because whether it was Lebanon or Iraq, the country is partitioned and it's over. You've heard about Iraq just a few years ago. I don't buy the notion that Syria is going or will be partitioned for a variety of reasons. First, because, and despite all the debate about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and somehow I think we know one thing about the state system in the Middle East, the creation of the modern state system, that boundaries are set. The United States sent 500,000 soldiers to protect the sanctity of Kuwait, despite everything that has happened in Iraq. I think what we're talking about, not the partition of Syria, but the de facto partition for Syria and the foreseeable future. This is a de facto partition country. Till the conditions change, 5 years, 10 years, where the camps get exhausted, the regional configuration of power changes, the great powers. In the meantime, the war continues. And again, the final point I want to make, when I conclude, keep talking about grand narratives and diversions and conversions and geostrategic struggles. I think in the meantime, the greatest crisis in Syria is not it's the humanitarian crisis. This is one of the greatest humanitarian crises since the second part of the 20th century. True. I wish you would go and visit some of the refugee camps. To give you an idea, I mean, the UN numbers don't reflect all the reality. You're talking about 9 million Syrians between displaced and refugees. According to UN sources, 50% of the 23 million Syrians are basically now on the brink of poverty. They need desperate help. This particular humanitarian crisis is also having major effects on neighboring countries. In Lebanon, you have 1 million refugees. In Jordan, you have about 800,000. In Iraq, I mean, I just came back from Turkey. What's really heartbreaking is the sight of Syrian children. I mean, filling the streets in the cold, freezing below zero. You have thousands of Syrian children, I mean, hungry, no shoes, thin shirts, on the streets. This is really what both stupid camps, both the opposition and the Assad regime don't see, because they can't win. I mean, Ahmad Jarba keeps saying, give us weapons. Well, so what? If the West gives you weapons, you think that Assads are going to... And Assad the same way, they believe in the same way. More weapons will win. But one of the bigger lessons is not just the humanitarian crisis, in terms of really some of us who studied the whole idea of protection. We thought that it used to be really solid, that somehow protection is deeply sacred. Well, not so. Because it seems to me, despite all the promises, the idea of protection, that in a way that Assad has used, I think, most weapons at his disposal, including chemical weapons. And he, in a way, he has been able to get away with it in giving, the fact is, the configuration of powers, American foreign policy, Russian foreign policy. So in this particular sense, unfortunately, if the Middle Eastern Institute invites me this year here to give a talk, we'll be talking about probably the 4th anniversary of the Syrian conflict. Thank you.